a thing that comes into it from having read the book a few times. You read the book a few times and yeah, it's just like the resurrection of the Christ.
When Mel Gibson revealed Ethiopian biblical writings about the end times, the greatest shock did not lie in natural catastrophe. What this 2,000-year-old body of scripture exposed instead was an invisible system of rule. In that vision, human beings are not imprisoned by chains, but by comfort and by the endless intoxication of entertainment. The horror does not come from ruins and devastation, but from the willing submission of a crowd whose psychology has been manipulated with extraordinary subtlety. We still tend to believe that humanity is waiting for some final collapse in the future. Yet according to these writings, the trap may have already closed, and all we are doing now is decorating the cage that holds us. The absence of violence. To understand why such a disturbing vision of cognitive control nearly vanished from Western history, we have to look back to the moment these texts were pushed out of public reach. After the Council of Nicaea in 325, the exclusion of many writings from the canon is often understood as part of an effort to unify doctrine across the Roman Empire. In the familiar telling, it was an act meant to protect the faith and remove teachings seen as deviant. But when we look closely at the Ge'ez manuscripts preserved in Ethiopia, a different picture begins to emerge. What was excluded was not merely a set of theological variations. Some of these texts read like a strikingly detailed description of a system of rule entirely unlike the forms of power the ancient world had known. For most of history, empires such as Babylon, Persia, and Rome maintained control through armies, threats, and physical punishment. Violence was the standard instrument for governing the masses. Yet in these censored writings, the final age is not defined by war, invasion, or rivers of blood. The Ethiopian Bible does not describe an enemy who rules by the sword. There are no armies sweeping across borders. No tyrant rises to power through blood and fire. Instead, the greatest danger comes from a structure of control that barely needs violence at all. That is what makes these texts so unusual. In the vision they present, people can be guided, managed, and slowly stripped of freedom without ever realizing they are imprisoned. Order remains intact. Society continues to function. There is no uprising, no cry for help, no spectacle of destruction that everyone can plainly see. The entire process unfolds in a silence so complete that it becomes deeply unsettling. That single difference changes how we read these ancient writings. If a text does not glorify violence or incite revolt, why was it buried? Perhaps what made it dangerous was not theology, but the fact that it described a mechanism of power so refined, a form of domination that needed no whip and yet could still govern human beings from within. And if it did not rely on fear, war, or physical destruction, then what instrument did such a system use to shape the consciousness of humanity itself? The mechanism of comfort. Instead of portraying the end times through war, plague, or catastrophic destruction, the ancient text preserved in Ethiopia offers a radically different image. The greatest threat of the final age does not arise from deprivation, but from constant satisfaction. In this account, human beings are subdued not by lashes or force, but by safety, convenience, and endless amusement. That is the most unusual part of all. The system of power outlined in the text does not depend on open coercion. It works by continually answering the immediate desires of the crowd, until comfort itself becomes the thing that keeps people still. When everything feels abundant and life is constantly filled with pleasant stimulation, the will to resist begins to weaken. History shows that resistance usually emerges when people are driven into want, oppression, or obvious suffering. But if a system can erase that feeling of lack, it can also erase the impulse to oppose it. Instead of generating fear, it creates the sensation of protection. Instead of taking things away, it keeps giving. Instead of destroying the outer world, it numbs the inner one. That is why the surface of society in this prophecy can still appear stable. There are no collapsing cities, no obvious scenes of chaos. Everything seems peaceful, even prosperous. Yet beneath that outer layer, the ability to think independently, to question, and to recognize danger is slowly worn away. Comfort is no longer the reward of civilization. It becomes an anesthetic for consciousness. That is what makes this vision so terrifying. For generations, people have associated the end of the world with extreme scarcity. But here, excess itself becomes the weapon. The danger is not that everything is taken away, but that people are given so much that they no longer feel any need to ask questions. They do not flee from disaster. They willingly remain inside a passive state because it feels too pleasant to abandon. An enemy that marches with armies can be identified. A regime built on violence can be resisted. But a system hidden behind comfort, entertainment, and the feeling of being cared for is far more dangerous, because it blurs the line between control and service. So how could a text born in the age of military empires describe with such precision a form of domination built on comfort? And once human beings grow accustomed to living in that lulled condition, what force continues to shape their thoughts and behavior? The illusion of choice. Yet comfort is still not the deepest layer of this mechanism. If safety and convenience form the first layer that causes people to stop resisting, the next layer is far more subtle. It is the feeling of being free to choose. The ancient text preserved in Ethiopia does not merely describe a society lulled to sleep by abundance. It also portrays a world in which human beings are surrounded by so many choices that they come to believe they command their own lives more than ever before. And that is precisely where the real trap begins to close. What makes this system so frightening is that it does not rule through prohibition, as in the familiar image of a dictatorship. It does not need to burn books, silence the crowd, or erect visible walls to control information. Instead, it does something almost opposite. It creates too many voices, too many signals, too many things to see, hear, and react to. Every moment is filled. Every silence is occupied. And when the human mind no longer has any empty space in which to step back, the ability to think coherently begins to dissolve. In these writings, collapse does not begin with fire in the sky or armies crossing the border. It begins with a smaller but decisive shift. Human beings no longer remain in silence long enough to hear their own true thoughts. They are wrapped in an unbroken stream of stimulation, one layer after another, until reflection is replaced by reaction. They no longer look at the world with depth. They only skim across it through brief flashes of attention. That is why the Ethiopian text does not treat endless choice as a certain sign of freedom. On the contrary, under certain conditions, it may become the most effective tool for weakening freedom. When people must constantly choose among hundreds of trivial things, they have less and less energy left to face the larger questions. They may choose what to watch, what to hear, what to discuss, and what to consume for amusement. Yet they no longer possess enough stillness to ask where the entire machinery is leading them. On the surface, this resembles self-determination. Each individual can believe that they are free simply because they are always allowed to choose. But the ability to choose does not always mean the ability to control. If all that is offered consists of shallow, short-lived, and meaningless options, then constant choosing only leaves the mind more exhausted, more scattered, and easier to guide. The feeling of mastery remains, but the capacity to perceive the true nature of one's condition has already begun to weaken. The text describes this mechanism with remarkable clarity. Human beings become obsessed with continuous stimulation. They no longer devote most of their time to seeking truth or confronting the central questions of existence. Instead, most of their mental energy is consumed by whatever has already been placed before their eyes. They are given the authority to decide countless small details of daily life, and that very fact creates a persuasive illusion that they remain in control. But in reality, they are only circling within a field of choices designed to keep them occupied, not awake. This is what makes these writings so unusual. Most ancient texts, when speaking of crisis, focus on concrete and visible things such as failed harvests, spreading disease, war, famine, and natural disaster. Here, however, The danger does not come from the collapse of the outer material world. It comes from overload within the mind itself. The text seems to understand that a society can continue functioning and may still appear stable from the outside, while inwardly it is slowly losing the ability to distinguish what truly matters. In such a world, noise is no longer just sound. It becomes the environment itself. It clings to every empty interval of the day and leaves people no chance to stop. Yet it is precisely in stopping that awareness begins to work. Once silence disappears, difficult truths also begin to feel distant, because they always require concentration, patience, and a degree of honesty with oneself that a life saturated with noise no longer allows. Distraction, therefore, ceases to be a harmless habit. It becomes a psychological cushion. It prevents people from looking directly at what is eroding beneath their feet. Each time they feel empty, anxious, or unsettled, the system stands ready to fill that gap with a new stimulus, a new image, a new controversy, a new form of entertainment, a new choice. In this way, the mind is never truly left alone long enough to realize that it is being carried away. The sharpest insight in the text lies in the fact that it does not present this as a sudden collapse. It presents it as a slow drift. A civilization does not have to be struck down by violence in order to decline. It can also wear itself away through constant fragmentation. It can lose its depth without losing its surface prosperity. It can grow weaker, not because there are too few voices, but because there are too many voices pressing against one another until nothing remains long enough in the mind to take root. That is the moment when the line between freedom and guidance begins to blur. A person who is forced will usually recognize the force. But a person kept busy by an endless range of attractive choices will struggle to realize that they are being controlled. They do not feel deprived. On the contrary, they may feel served, empowered, and satisfied faster than ever before. And it is precisely that feeling which makes the entire mechanism far more dangerous than open violence. A visible prison always has walls, bars, and guards. But the prison described in this text has no need for any of them. It only needs to make people accustomed to living without ever truly concentrating. It only needs to make them spend their mental energy on choices that do not matter. It only needs to make them confuse constant movement with genuine progress. At that point, they still imagine they are moving forward, when in fact, they are only circling within a maze covered in light, sound, and the sensation of freedom. And that may be the most terrifying point in the entire mechanism. Human beings are not broken from the outside. They are gradually shaped from within. No chains are required. No prison is required. No tyrant needs to appear in public. All that is needed is an environment loud enough, seductive enough, and full of enough choices that the mind no longer has the strength to return to the largest questions of all. Then, submission no longer takes the form of fear. It takes the form of busyness. Imprisonment no longer takes the form of a wall. It takes the form of a life that is always filled. And the loss of freedom no longer begins when everything is taken away from people, but when they are given so many meaningless things that they can no longer recognize what is truly worth holding on to. If a system can keep people in such a condition, then the real cage is not outside society. It exists within the mechanisms of attention, within the habit of choosing, and within the way each person responds to the emptiness inside themselves. And once that cage has been built from within, the next question becomes unavoidable. What is forging the invisible bars of that inner prison? The inner cage, the immense scale of the end times in Western tradition, is reduced by the Ethiopian text to the dimensions of a single mind. In the book of Revelation within the Roman tradition, the seven seals appear as events of cosmic magnitude: falling stars, global war, famine, and death sweeping across the earth. Yet the texts preserved in the highlands of Africa define these seven seals according to a structure that contains no external destructive force at all. It removes the idea of spatial devastation and recasts the seals as states of inner collapse attached to each individual person. The greatest battle does not unfold on blood-soaked fields of war, but within the mechanism of human decision-making in the face of comfort and fear. The first seal is not a plague, but the unconditional preference for ease. It is described as the moment when an individual chooses to avoid a disturbing truth in exchange for a surface sense of safety. Under this seal, inquiry is suspended indefinitely in order to protect the comfort zone of awareness. The next is the seal of pride, recorded not as arrogance in the obvious sense, but as a quiet certainty. It is the condition in which a person becomes completely convinced that they already possess the whole truth, and therefore willingly stop listening and stop receiving anything new. This form of pride erects the strongest defensive barrier against every attempt to change one's perspective. The system continues to strengthen its control through the third seal, fear. A life ruled entirely by the need for security will be ready to ignore any injustice simply to preserve a temporary sense of stability. Alongside fear stands the seal of distraction, designed to ensure that no empty space is ever allowed to appear. Every moment of stillness must be filled with ceaseless activity or entertainment, completely blocking the voice of reflection. The sharpness of the text is further revealed in its recognition of the fifth seal as the need to belong to a false community. In this condition, individuals surround themselves only with those who constantly agree with them, creating a sealed chamber of repetition. Any information that contradicts the core beliefs of the group is immediately cast back out. Alongside this comes false mercy in the sixth seal, where excuse-making and the avoidance of responsibility are draped in the language of grace, ensuring that true correction never takes place. Finally, the most devastating seal is identified as the shell of formal religion, when ritual and sacred language are used as perfect masks to conceal a consciousness that has become completely numb. By shifting the center of gravity from physical events to psychological habits, the text transforms the very nature of imprisonment. A system that operates through these 7 inner seals does not need to spend its resources building physical prisons to confine billions of people. Instead, it provides the mechanisms through which each individual gathers the materials and constructs a private cage by hand. The materials of that cage are pride, the fear of isolation, and an insatiable hunger for recognition from others. Within this structure, no one can remain merely a passive victim waiting to be rescued. The mechanism of control borrows human consent and humanity's craving for comfort in order to function. Every decision to avoid the truth, every hour surrendered to entertainment, every search for reassurance within a complicit collective becomes an act that further strengthens the cage. By fully internalizing imprisonment, the ruling system erases the boundary between oppressor and oppressed. And if the force establishing these rules does not rely on any supernatural power or physical catastrophe, then what kind of knowledge are these ancient lines truly trying to preserve? The blueprint of manipulation. At this level of textual detail, the familiar belief that the Ethiopian Bible is merely a collection of mystical religious prophecies can no longer defend itself against the very mechanisms it describes. For centuries, history has approached these materials through the lens of early faith, searching for hidden codes about the end of the earth or the arrival of supernatural powers. Yet the complete absence of external forces, combined with the extraordinary precision with which the text describes a mind filled by entertainment and the 7 seals of behavior, has shattered the stability of those traditional interpretations. What was once preserved as a pious prophecy now reveals the structure of something entirely different. The sequence of decay, from a society flooded with endless meaningless choices to individuals paralyzed within self-constructed echo chambers, does not bear the signature of divine revelation. Instead, it carries the internal logic of a psychological analysis. There is a difficult and unsettling resemblance between these writings, preserved across 2 millennia, and the operating logic of modern systems of informational control. The idea of constant comfort, fragmented attention, and rule through noise aligns with striking precision to theories about how content distribution algorithms, social media, and the modern economy of consumption now function. That resemblance forces us to consider a possibility that overturns the usual view of ancient knowledge. It may be that historical interpretation has profoundly misunderstood the true nature of these records. The fact that an ancient document contains such a detailed system of crowd psychology, behavioral control, and nonviolent domination suggests that this is not a mystical vision at all. It may instead represent a remarkably early understanding of how mass manipulation works. These writings seem to preserve a primitive yet fully formed body of knowledge about the use of distraction as a way to permanently weaken the strength of an entire population. This possibility also provides a firmer explanation for the political decisions surrounding the Council of Nicaea. The removal of this material from the canon may not have arisen from an effort to protect doctrinal purity. The deeper concern may have been that the text contained a blueprint exposing the exact mechanism of nonviolent psychological rule for an empire or for any centralized structure of power, allowing the public to recognize that comfort, entertainment, and the illusion of choice can function as an invisible prison would have been an unacceptable risk. The complete exclusion of these texts may therefore have been an attempt to prevent the crowd from learning how such instruments of rule could be broken. Once these Ge'ez writings are no longer read as symbolic images of punishment, but as a blueprint of cognitive manipulation, the gravity of the problem changes entirely. They suggest that this invisible structure of imprisonment is not something waiting in a distant future. It may be a pattern already operating at full scale in the present. And if a system of rule built on satisfaction has truly locked the behavior of the masses through their own consent, then one question becomes unavoidable. Do these ancient records also preserve a way to break the closed loop of manipulation they describe? The silencing of the algorithm. The final consequence recorded in the Ethiopian Biblical text does not point toward a grand rescue. Unlike the familiar structure of many religious traditions, where a mighty supernatural force appears at the last moment to destroy evil, this ancient record preserves a closed law of cause and effect to the very end. No outside power intervenes to shatter the empire of comfort. The ancient material indicates that this invisible system of rule can be neutralized through only one path: the breaking of inner captivity by separate individuals. The figures the text identifies as the final witnesses possess no supernatural powers. They are not exceptional leaders, nor are they elite figures commanding vast platforms of public influence. Their only distinguishing trait is that they see through the illusion of freedom built on entertainment, and they decisively refuse to participate in the cycle of distraction. They recognize the materials that form the inner cage within themselves, and they refuse to reinforce them. This awareness does not become a loud rebellion. It appears instead through the act of stopping the consumption of meaningless stimuli supplied by the system. The text emphasizes that the presence of such individuals will be made entirely invisible by the system itself. They are stripped of platforms, pushed aside from central conversations, and blurred beneath an overwhelming flood of informational noise. Yet this enforced silence is presented as the clearest proof that the mechanism of manipulation has encountered points it cannot absorb. In this state, truth does not need to spread through platforms or public speeches. It exists as a self-contained body of knowledge that refuses to be broken apart by noise. There is no promise that this vast system of manipulation will collapse. The destruction of the ruling structure is not what the text predicts. Instead, it offers only one assurance: the system will lose all ability to analyze, direct, and manage those who have consciously severed themselves from the comfort it provides. When an individual nullifies the 7 seals within the structure of their own decision-making, that person becomes invisible to the tools of control built on distraction. The system cannot imprison a being that no longer desires the satisfactions it offers. The ending event, therefore, is not tied to the destruction of material civilization. It is simply the end of the effectiveness of a model of control. No dramatic salvation is placed on display, and no supernatural sign appears in the sky. The final vision preserved by Ethiopian monks through lines of Ge'ez writing is only the stillness of individuals who have chosen to stand outside the current of constant stimulation. What remains is an empty field of awareness, stripped of every theological covering so that it may face a sharper truth. History may not have concealed a story about the divine at all. It may have concealed a highly precise system of psychological analysis. And that realization forces every mind to confront an unresolved reality. No one can clearly determine where they stand while living inside an environment that never stops supplying distraction in order to sustain invisible cages of entertainment.